Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Green Effect Podcast. This is episode number 30. Yes, we have hit the big 3-0. And for episode 30, we've got a great guest on today, Lisa Nadon. She is a paralegal with Small Matters here in Kitchener-Waterloo. This is part 1 of 2 because we just kept talking. There were so many great things we wanted to talk about. Before we get into that, though, keep in mind we do have a sponsor, and that is Ignite Volleyball Club. So if you have a young one who is looking for a great youth program to start volleyball and just have a blast, check out the website, ignitevolleyball.ca. Programs are running right now for fall. Here we go with Lisa. We're going to talk about her background, her dreams and aspirations of being a paralegal when she was a teenager. Well, not really, but we're going to talk about how she got into this. What does a paralegal even do? When do they get involved? Why is she so critical to this whole process when you're a landlord? What she recommends landlords do when they take on a new tenant. I can tell you right now for both these episodes, have a pen and paper ready, jot some things down, because when I heard some of the things she was talking about, it's just incredible information. So how to make sure you pick the right tenant. We talk about that as well. Make sure you do your paperwork right. So if you were like me as a kid, and you were that one kid in the back of the class who had to do their homework 50 times over to get it right, you may want to talk to Lisa about some options for her helping you out. And finally, that standard lease agreement. You'd think it was pretty simple? Not so much. There's do's and don'ts on that too. Again, another note-taking section, we'll call it. Lots of great information, part 1 and 2. Here goes part 1 with Lisa.
Welcome to the Green Effect Podcast. Finance, life, business, and everything in between. And now, your host, Stephen Green.
Welcome, everyone, to the Green Effect Podcast. We have Lisa Nadon, who is the owner of Small Matters Paralegal. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
My pleasure. So you are definitely in high demand. You are someone who deals with landlords primarily and how they manage their tenants, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, good. So I got a lot of questions for you. And I'm sure these are probably questions you've heard before quite often. So should be a good podcast that way. So before we get into it, we always want to know all about our guests. So tell me about your path in business, career. Were you in high school saying I want to be a paralegal working with landlords?
No. So
Okay.
I started out in high school. My passion was parks and rec, so forestry. So I went to school for forestry, or as my mom and many people said, to get my tree climbing 101. That didn't pan out. Came back, started working for a law firm who put me through, at that time, what was considered law clerk program. They didn't have a paralegal program back in the day. So I took all the law clerk programs, worked for the law firm for over 5 years, left. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do after that. Had a few friends who owned businesses and said, hey, I've got some unpaid accounts. Why don't you help us out? You're not working right now. And that's really how I fell into the paralegal industry. Up until probably 7 years ago, my mainstay was small claims court. My passion was landlord and tenant. Very hard to get that relationship going. Kitchener-Waterloo is a very loyal group of people for the most part, or at least that's what I've always sort of thought they were, and they still are. And so to go into obtaining landlords or people that needed my services, it required a lot of work, a lot of referrals, and it just took time to get into that. So now I'm 90% landlord and tenant, 5% small claims.
Okay. And so when did you start all that then? That actually building your business and getting your referral sources and stuff like that?
Okay, so I've been practicing for 20 years.
Okay.
We were grandfathered in as paralegals, so now you need anywhere between a 2 to 4 year program as a paralegal and then have to write an exam to become a licensed paralegal. Similar to lawyers, the Law Society is the governing body of all legal professionals. So the courses run, well, not the courses, the exam runs through the Law Society, courses run through various colleges in the area. Back in my day, 20 years ago, we didn't have that. We had to write an exam once we became licensed, and then we were grandfathered in.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And you said it like it's the community is a small community that way. Everyone kind of knows everybody and stuff like that. So when you would have come in, I mean, so I know 20 years ago, but that first 10 years was really the ramp up of people kind of getting into rental properties. And then the last 10 years has been Ion and new investors and Toronto investors and all sorts of stuff, right? So
That's right.
you've kind of seen the whole gamut of stuff in this community, right?
I've seen a lot.
Yeah, I bet. Oh, we're getting to that. Don't worry. Okay, so your business. So you're a paralegal. You just talked a little bit about what a paralegal is.
Mm-hmm.
Where does a paralegal come into supporting landlords and managing process? Like, where do you come into this whole thing?
Okay. Hopefully I never have to come in, but
Good point.
that's
Okay.
unfortunate reality is that I am required from time to time. Where a paralegal can come in is they can educate new landlords or new investors as to the process, because there is a process. There is a governing body, the Landlord and Tenant Board. The Act is Residential Tenancies Act, which governs all residential tenancies in Ontario. So residential tenancy is your primary residence or that of primary residence of a tenant. Landlords need to follow those rules and regulations to the letter, and if they do it effectively, they can, I don't know what the right word is. It's not that they can evict tenants, because that's not really the whole basis of it, but it is one of the avenues. But they can
Manage their
business
Yeah.
to the letter of the law and ensure that things are done right, so that if things do fall off the rails, we can move quickly and efficiently to correct that. And one of those corrections may be eviction. There are lots of other ways of handling that process.
Yeah, and I think too, it's one of those things where there are rules, and I think it goes both ways, because I think you've got to uphold a certain quality, maybe is the right term, for landlords, so that if they do have to go to that point, at least the tenant has been given opportunity, proper due process has been followed, that sort of thing. So as frustrating as it might be, I can appreciate that part too, and I'm sure you do too, because it sounds like your job is easier. There's probably less expense, time and money to the landlord if that is done properly too, right?
Absolutely. And if the landlords are educated, then they're going to know what steps to follow or how to address certain situations, which may or may not require the aid of a tribunal or an adjudicated decision.
Yeah. At all costs, you probably want to avoid that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so so you represent landlords, and you've already said you've seen it all. I'm sure you've seen it all. When they're accepting tenants, what should they be looking for? Like what? I mean, I would assume, and I've got a different hat on. I'm a bank guy, so I look at things totally different. I know that. I mean, I would assume a simple credit bureau to start. What should they be doing? What are some best practices for landlords?
Okay. So when you're looking at prospective tenants, there are a number of things that you really need to look at. The first one being educate yourself on human rights for the first option. Absolutely get an application, a rental application, get information, check that information. Just because they write it down does not necessarily mean that information is accurate.
You're talking to the mortgage guy, right? Yeah.
Call the employers. Call the references. Are you going to get a good reference from those references? Of course, so they wouldn't be putting them down there. Know that when you are calling back these references, you have to ask yes or no questions. So as a landlord, if you were to get a call from someone saying, I've got one of your tenants, they're looking at renting my place, can you tell me if they've been good? Well, that leaves it very open to a human rights complaint, and possibly a privacy complaint. So you can't really just say, well, this tenant was a horrible person and they trashed my place and I wouldn't rent to them, because you open yourself up to possibly a lawsuit in that regard.
I heard one landlord say he never calls the current landlord because they're always going to say great things. Oh, they're fantastic. Oh, you're in for a treat. I always heard that. Never call the current landlord.
Well, and it's okay to, I would disagree. I would say it's okay to call a current landlord. Make sure you frame your questions, because they can answer yes or no. Has your tenant paid rent on time?
Right.
Yes. Have you ever had to take your tenant to the landlord and tenant board? That's a yes or no question.
And they're allowed to disclose that, I'm assuming.
They can say yes or no.
Okay.
Has your tenant damaged the unit? Yes or no. Very specific questions.
What if they lie? Like, and do you see that?
I don't know that you're ever going to get 100% truth from anybody.
Okay.
I think if you do your due diligence, personally, as a past landlord, if we asked for applications to be returned along with telling them that we do credit checks, those tenants who would prefer to stay in the shadows are not bringing back that application. Okay, so you're going to get those ones pretty much out of the way right away.
That's true. That's very true.
You may not get away with professional, we call them professional tenants coming in, some that are a little more able to circumvent certain questions. Listen to your gut.
Yeah, very true.
Okay, because a lot of people, depending on how badly they want the place, they may have a lovely story for you. There may be reasons why they're coming in, and then lo and behold, you might end up with someone who you didn't want in there. So you can ask for anything. You cannot demand things. So certain examples are, we always recommend a driver's license, copy of a driver's license, at the very least date of birth, because if you have someone called Lisa Smith putting in an application, how are you going to do a credit check on Lisa Smith? There might be hundreds of Lisa Smiths, so we need an identifier.
Because you also can't, the social insurance number is definitely not mandatory, as an example, because that's another thing that used to help find the person, just speaking from mortgage credit, right?
They still do offer SIN numbers, but the problem is they don't give you a lot of information. SIN numbers are not something we can extract information. Driver's licenses have date of birth, have an expiry date on it, wherein they have to renew their new address. So if by chance you had a tenant who you end up with an order against for money, somewhere down the line, they're going to need to renew their driver's license. We can obtain new address information once they do that. So that is a great way to start getting that information.
Yeah.
Other options, some landlords I have heard ask for criminal records checks. Again, like I said, you can ask for certain things. It can't be forced.
What about credit check? So can I would assume there's a form to sign to authorize the credit bureau check. What if they say, well, I already have one, I'll give one to you?
They still need to sign any rental application should have a clause on the bottom, basically where the tenant acknowledges that they allow this person to do a credit check from time to time, which is important.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Okay, so it's not just a credit check for the purposes of the rental application. That's one part of it.
Right.
The next part of it is going to be from time to time. What if something changes? What if they owe you rent money? What if they choose to leave? We can do another credit check providing they have consented to that.
So if you find out, so you're, and you talk about gut, I always use a term, my spidey sense. So rent starts to come late, you start to notice things are getting made up, whatever, can you say, okay, I'm not feeling right. I've got the authorization to pull from quote time to time. Can I pop in there, pull it, see what's going on? And then if I know there's a problem, is there a process from there? Or is it just, okay, now I know there's a problem, I better work this out, or give out the N4?
There's notices. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we'll talk about that in
sure.
a minute. But just to finish on the application, I think the credit check is really just to see what the status. From there, you can't take that credit check to an adjudicator or a court and say, see, they need to go because, they don't have any money anymore. It's just more for your own information to maybe start the processes. It may work in your favor to negotiate something with that tenant if times have changed.
That makes sense. That's very interesting. I never thought about that wording like that, but that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. And I think one last point with applications, because we've kind of talked about it a lot. I think the one thing that I had heard that a landlord does do, I thought it was an awesome idea, is they don't allow drop-offs of the application. They will go and pick it up at their current location. So what you get from that, where do they live? How do they live? What does their place look like? In a very brief sense, but I thought that was a fantastic idea. Yes, it takes a little more time, but you get the wrong tenant in, you could be $30,000 out of damage or rent or something later on. So
makes
that
complete
extra
sense.
half hour is definitely worth it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm thinking that's what this podcast is going to be. It's going to be a lot of really neat best practices like that. I didn't even think about that. Already I've got 2 or 3 things, like I'm not saying pull one every few months, but that ability to, and then of course, visiting where they live and yes or no. Okay, good. No, this is good. There's going to be one, I can just see people like making notes for this podcast. I'm already thinking about stuff like this. So, okay, and we're going to jump around a little bit. So let's go into the next point, but I can see where this is all going to go. So, so standard lease agreement.
Yes.
So we've got one now. I mean, I think it's pretty hard to mess it up, right? Is it? Like, what are some do's and don'ts on this?
Standardized lease agreement was brought out by the Ministry of Housing. So anyone that is looking for that, you go to the Ministry of Housing website. So this is not a Residential Tenancies Act form or Landlord and Tenant Board form. This is Ministry of Housing specific form. So Landlord and Tenant Board says you have to use this standardized lease form. I don't think you can really mess it up. It is 14 pages long. Don't get scared by that. 7 of those pages are check boxes or fill in the blanks with the correct information. 7 of the following pages is really information, mainly geared towards the tenant. What's required, can you have rent deposits, all kinds of things. So it's informational.
Yeah, it's like an appendix, if I remember correctly, right? I think that's what it's just.
I think so.
I only know that because I just went through a few leases this morning, and that's all it was. So
yeah, I think some of the do's and don'ts with this standardized lease agreement is, 1, you absolutely have to have full landlord contact information. Okay, you can't leave an email. It has to be an address, a mailing address, a delivery address. Nobody cares if it's a P.O. box if you don't want them knowing where your home address is, but it needs to be a physical address.
Yeah, and if you are, if you're single, if you're a senior, we'll say maybe a vulnerable sector, we'll say, yeah, you don't want them to know where you live, right? So, okay, so you can do P.O. boxes and stuff like that. Perfect, okay.
Or care of someone.
Okay.
Which is totally fine. Double, triple, quadruple check the tenants' names. Need to be accurate. That same accuracy needs to happen in every notice as well. So make that a very particular point, which again, your driver's license is your accurate legal name.
That's what we should be using.
So you really should just grab a copy of it. It helps you in so many ways. The next thing with that, any check boxes wherein there's smoking rules or requiring insurance or those kinds of things, the lease agreement has a small little space where you can write things in, My suggestion is, if you have a smoking policy, if you have other kinds of policies, just say see attached. You can attach terms and conditions, you can attach addendums to the end of the 14 pages of the lease agreement.
And you can come up with your own stuff?
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So smoking rules, just to say it's a no smoking unit, what are those smoking rules?
Right.
Okay. No smoking of any substance. Like, this is a big one. I hear this all the time. We get a ton of complaints of smoking. Marijuana is the big one now because it smells distinctively worse than regular cigarette smoke.
You know what it smells like. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's more bothersome, I think, to more people than potentially smoking would have been.
Yeah.
So you need to be clear on what smoking of substance is not allowed. No smoking of any substance. So that doesn't leave anything up for question.
So if you want to say, I've got a unit, no smoking of any substance, no cats, no dogs, no whatever the rules are.
You won't say no cats, no dogs, because that's not allowed.
Oh, we can't say that?
No.
Okay.
Unless there's a specific reason. Shared ventilation and someone is highly allergic, then yes, there are always exemptions to those
So
rules.
that's only going to come into play really if it's a multi-residential of some sort, I'm assuming.
Like a
Duplex,
small,
triplex.
that's right, or a converted house, or...
Okay. If the owner has allergies and I do my due diligence, I visit there every quarter to, I don't know, inspect the furnace.
I don't know, not for landlord, it would be for other tenants.
Okay.
So let's say you had a tenant upstairs who was on an oxygen tank, she'd been there 20 years. The downstairs tenant, that unit is a non-smoking unit. You would be specific in that clause saying it is a non-smoking unit, a non-smoking building. It is a shared ventilation system. We have tenants who absolutely cannot have smoking.
Okay. Well, especially if they're on oxygen.
Correct.
I mean, that's...
Yep.
The whole place could go up in flames, right?
Right.
So, okay. Okay, so add things in, but of course they have to be within, I think you mentioned at this beginning, within the human rights code too, right?
Well, sure. So policies should be drafted in such a way that it allows the tenant to know what can or can't be done. So terms and conditions policies. The no smoking, what exactly do you mean? Because maybe it's a non-smoking building, but the unit itself is not non-smoking, or you're transitioning that building from a non-smoking, from a smoking building to a non-smoking building, and you can do that as well. So
Be specific.
those are hard. Yep. Yeah. And that's where I think
specific
a paralegal...
but general. No smoking of any substance, right? Like it's...
That's right. And I mean, I think that's where a paralegal can help too. So sometimes you can try and do these things on your own. Sometimes you can find examples online. A lot of times you're going to find examples that are out of province or out of country, so they may or may not be relevant. Yeah. There are lots of places that you can obtain that information, or even just a quick call to either your real estate lawyer if you are a new landlord. They can help you with here's a quick clause, or is this okay? Yeah. It doesn't have to cost a lot to do that. Just... I always say common sense.
Yeah.
Okay. You can Google the RTA, which is Residential Tenancies Act. You can even call that number and get that question asked. Can I ask for this? Can I say this? The people on the end of the phone at Landlord and Tenant Board are going to answer those questions if they can answer that question.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's in their best interest to help with that, because that's going to avoid future problems, right? And that's a free service, I'm assuming, right?
Yep.
Give them a call and they can, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So, any other do's and don'ts on the lease? What about full or monthly? So, tenant comes up and they want to rent, and to make it more attractive, here's 1 year of lease up front, and here's all the rental income.
What do you mean 1 year of lease up front? Like so, they've paid up front?
Yeah, paying up front, exactly.
Okay, so that one is a touchy one. The Act states that you can only ask for 1 month rent as deposit, specifically for the last month's rent. Okay, you cannot ask for security deposits. You cannot ask for damage deposits. You can't ask for those kinds of deposits.
And that's in Ontario, to be clear, right?
In Ontario, yes. You can ask for a key deposit so long as that key deposit amount is reasonable for the replacement of keys.
25, $50.
Sure, unless it's a fob
Yeah.
in a
fair
building.
enough. Yeah.
So we get a lot of that with the student rentals. So fobs are
Right.
more expensive to replace. So reasonable. What you can't ask for is, I want the whole year up front because I like you, but I have a bad feeling in my gut, so I just want all the money up front. It can be voluntary, though.
Okay.
So if a tenant does come, and we have had it, they can offer the year up front. I strongly suggest you get that in writing. That basically says, I have voluntarily offered this amount for the landlord to hold as a rent, as deposit for the year's rent to be taken into account each month.
Okay.
If I choose to leave, all that money comes back. Because
Is it advisable?
I would advise against taking a full year, but
Okay.
I have had it happen.
Yeah. Harder. Is there anything? So if I'm a landlord, I don't know. Maybe I look at things too glass half empty all the time, but I always start to ask questions. Why? Why would you offer this to me? Right? Is there risk there? Is there stuff you've seen where they're giving this to you, they're offering it to you because this could possibly happen?
Really, worst case scenario, if that was to happen with the landlord and tenant board, is you'd be ordered to send it all back, to give the money back that hasn't been there. So you're not supposed to take more than 1 year. Worst case, if you're constantly going into the landlord and tenant board with cases wherein you've been voluntarily given a year's rent, there are risks. The landlord and tenant board can fine you. There are things that can happen, so it is a little bit risky. Again, there's not many people that are going to ask for that up front.
Especially with rental incomes going higher too,
Yeah.
right? That's a lot of money.
You'd see it internationally, so international students. So when I do deal with student rentals, you may see it for tenancies like that, where they're out of country.
Do you see that more with maybe they're new to Canada? So like Waterloo, we have a lot of international students, right? Maybe they don't have credit, they have nothing in Canada. Do you see that more there, where to try to make it more attractive to find a place to live, they offer up a year or 2 years or what? I mean, I know 2 years not allowed, but here's a year of rental amount.
To clarify, any amount, if they're voluntarily going to give it to you, it's not restricted for 1 year.
Oh, okay.
I honestly, in 20 years of practice, I've seen it twice. One, because it was an international student. The second time was just a regular resident who wanted to give that kind of money up for the year.
Oh, okay. Fair enough then.
But I don't get that very often.
Back when rents were $700 a month.
Maybe. So I think lease agreements in general, the question I have is, what's the benefit or detriment to me if we sign a 1 year lease?
Yeah.
1 year leases are fine. They do add some security for the landlord. They don't hold a ton of security because a tenant could still say, I need to leave, and give 60 days notice.
Within the first year.
Within the first year.
Fair enough.
The landlord has an obligation to try to mitigate their losses. So while they would say, well, you're in a 1 year lease agreement, we'll attempt to re-rent it, but you also have to try to re-rent it. We will agree to sublet or assign, provided the application comes back for us for approval. But at the end of the day, the tenants can give 60 days notice. They can leave. Those tenants run the risk that they could be liable for rent owing once they're gone until the unit is re-rented. But the landlord will need to show that they in fact put that unit right of priority, not just advertised them with the other 60 other units they have. Judges are going to look at, how did you try to re-rent this specific unit first?
Okay.
And in Waterloo region, if you can't rent it in 60 days, it's slim chance that you're not going to be able to rent it within 60 days.
Yeah. As long as your property is good, right? It's not, yeah, okay.
The risk with a 12-month is if you plan on selling.
Of course.
So if you plan on selling or plan on having some kind of notice where it's what we call a no-fault notice to the tenants, most of those notices are based on termination date being the end of the lease term.
Okay.
So that could be problematic.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, because then you also have two, I mean, the other way to terminate a lease too, can you do it within 1 year if you're moving into it? Like 6 months
If the landlord is going to move in?
Yeah.
No.
Or the landlord's kid or
No.
whatever. Okay, so that you cannot get away with.
Correct.
Okay. That term has to be done.
Yep.
Okay.
And
All
I
right.
mean, really, month to month, they still need to give 60 days notice.
Sure.
I don't really know I find sometimes there may be more risk into a 1-year lease than... It depends on the situation. It depends on the rental.
Yeah,
I mean,
so too.
basement apartment rentals are going to be constantly turning over. Condo unit rentals probably may not be, or rentals in a high-rise with a 3-bedroom, and those are probably a little less likely to have a high turnover.
Yeah. Yeah, depending on the area, depending on the tenant too, I guess, right? Or
Right.
what kind of tenant you're attracting.
That's right.
Like
So,
that's-
and just to point out, I do a lot with student rentals. So student rentals, we do things differently with student rentals. So if there's anyone that has student rentals or wants more information on student rentals, definitely seek out somebody because things are different. How you would draft the lease is different. There are many variables there.
And there you go. There's part 1 with Lisa. If you liked this episode, wait till the second episode. It's longer and there's more note-taking opportunities. Free paralegal advice here on the Green Effect podcast. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Twitter. The handle is RBC Stephen Green, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Green Effect Podcast. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Google Play so you catch the next episode. And don't forget to leave a review. Much appreciated.